Hello, and welcome to the Heathen Trans Girl podcast with me, your host, Kaya Fox. Today's episode is all about funeral practices and the road to hell as described in the lore. So in the past episode, we saw an example of a ship burial. A very elaborate, very beautiful ship burial. But ship burials were not the only kind of funeral practice of the Norse Viking Age. Chamber graves were also fairly popular, like that of BJ581, who we are going to explore in the next episode. There were also memorial stones with names and artwork etched into them, as well as cremation practices. So in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at what the Eddas, some different sagas, and one outsider's account say on the matter of burial and cremation through the Norse mythology lens and in the Viking Age in general. Today's sources are Heimskringla, translated by Finlay and Faulkes, 2011, the Poetic Edda, Henry Adams Bellows translation, 1936. The Prose Edda, Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur translation, 1916. And Ibn Fadlān and the Rūsiyyah as translated by James Montgomery. As always, the specific sources, chapters, and stanzas will be listed in the show notes down below. Today's first account I have dubbed The Age of Burning and the Age of Mounds, and it is found in the Prologue of Ynglinga Saga, which is the first book of Heimskringla. Now this is Snorri's euhemerized account, so it does view the gods as human, though they evolve to divinity at some point. So we do see example of the burial of Freyr in this. The first age is called the Age of Burning. At that time, all dead people had to be burned and memorial stones raised for them. But after that, Freyr had been interred in a mound at Uppsalir. Many rulers built mounds as well as memorial stones in memory of their kinsmen. But after Danir in Mikalati, king of the Danes, had had a mound built for himself, and commanded that he should be carried into it when he was dead, with his royal robes and armor, and his horses, with all its saddle gear and many other goods, and many people of his line had done later the same. Then the Age of Mounds began here in Denmark, though the Age of Burning continued long after among the Svíar and Norwegians. So here we have an example of an age where cremation and memorial stones were more common, and then the evolution of burial mounds, even giving an example of one king who had a very elaborate mound with horses, their tackle, everything. A lot of grave goods included inside the mound. And it ends with the mention that both the Age of Burning and the Age of Mounds coexisted simultaneously and were even localized practices to some extent. So I think this is a good passage to start off with, showing that there were many different practices going on at that time, and some of them were specific to local regions. Good one to start out with. Our next passage is still coming from Ynglinga Saga in Heimskringla. This one is chapter 8. It's maybe a little bit more popular of an attestation. I feel like people refer to it, and movies will sometimes craft scenes around what is said here. But this one I have called Odin's Law. Chapter 8. Odin established in his land the laws that had previously been observed among the Æsir. He ordained that all dead people must be burned, and that their possessions should be laid on a pyre with them. He said that everyone should come to Valhall with such wealth as he had on his pyre, and that each would also have the benefit of whatever he himself had buried in the earth. But the ashes were to be taken out to sea or buried down in the earth, and the mounds were to be built as memorials to great men, and memorial stones were to be raised for all those who were of any account, and this custom lasted for a long time after that. So in this passage, we get the idea of being able to take one's possessions with them, if they were either on a funeral pyre or buried in the earth. They could be taken by the dead into the afterlife, or a afterlife. We also get a description of what to do with the ashes, and the idea that mounds were more often built for wealthy people, and memorial stones were built for people of some account. Maybe that had to do with wealth as well. So you might not necessarily get a memorial stone or a mound if you were not a person of wealth in that age. Our next passage comes from Gylfaginning, chapter 49 of the Prose Edda. And in this we have the story of Baldur's ship Pyre, as well as a ride on the road to Hel and back. The death of Baldur is a fairly popular story in Norse mythology. And so this is a passage that a decent amount of people will be a little more familiar with. And in it we see the funeral process of having a boat launched into the water, the pyre built on the boat, and then lit on fire. So we have the boat on fire in the water. That is often seen in shows like the Vikings and things like that. So there is some not necessarily historical context for that, but more mythological context for that specific instance. So I will read through this chapter and then take a pause and break it down for you and highlight some things. Now when the gods had come to themselves, Frigg spake, and asked who there might be among the Asir that would fain have for his own all her love and favour. Let him ride the road to Hel, and seek if he may find Baldur, and offer Hel a ransom, if she will let Baldur come home to Asgard. And he is named Hermod the Bold, Odin's son, who undertook that embassy. Then Sleipnir was taken, Odin's steed, and led forward, and Hermod mounted on that horse and galloped off. The Asir took the body of Baldur and brought it to the sea. Hringhorni is the name of Baldur's ship. It was greatest of all ships. The gods would have launched it and made Baldur's pyre thereon, but the ship stirred not forward. Then word was sent to Jotunheim after that giantess, who was called Hyrrokin. When she had come, riding a wolf and having a viper for bridle, then she leapt off the steed, and Odin called to 4 berserkers to tend the steed. But they were not able to hold it until they had felled it. Then Hyrrokin went to the prow of the boat and thrust it out at the first push, so that fire burst from the rollers, and all lands trembled. Thor became angry and clutched his hammer, and would straightway have broken her head, had not the gods prayed for peace for her. Then was the body of Baldur borne out on shipboard, and when his wife, Nanna, the daughter of Nep, saw that, straightway her heart burst with grief, and she died. She was borne to the pyre, and the fire was kindled. Then Thor stood by, and hallowed the pyre with Mjolnir, and before his feet ran a certain dwarf, which was named Lithr. Thor kicked at him with his foot, and thrust him into the fire, and he burned. People of many races visited the burning. First is to be told of Odin, how Frigg and the Valkyries went with him and his ravens. But Freyr drove in his chariot, and the boar called Goldmane or Fearful Tusk, and Heimdallr rode on the horse of Goldtop, and Freya drove her cats. Thither also much people of the rim giants and the hill giants. Odin laid on the pyre that gold ring, which is called Draupnir. This quality attended it, that every 9th night there dropped from it 8 gold rings of equal weight. Baldur's horse was led to the balefire with all his trappings. Now it is to be told concerning Hermod, that he rode 9 nights through dark dales and deep, so that he saw not before he was come to the river Gjöll, and rode on to the Gjöll bridge, which bridge is thatched with glittering gold. Mothgud is the maid who guards the bridge. She asked him his name and race, saying that the day before there had ridden over the bridge 5 companies of men, but the bridge thunders no less under thee alone, and thou hast not the colour of dead men. Why ridest thou hither on Hel-way? He answered, I am appointed to ride to Hel to seek out Baldur. Hast thou perchance seen Baldur on Hel-way? She said that Baldur had ridden there over Gjöll bridge, but down and north lieth Hel-way. Then Hermod rode on till he came to Helgate. He dismounted from his steed and made his girths fast, mounted, and pricked him with his spurs, and the steed leapt so hard over the gate that he came nowise near to it. Then Hermod rode home to the hall, and dismounted from his steed, went into the hall, and saw sitting there in the high seat Baldur, his brother. And Hermod tarried there overnight. At morn Hermod prayed Hel that Baldur might ride home with him, and told her how great weeping was among the Æsir. But Hel said that in this wise it should be put to the test, whether Baldur were so all beloved as had been said. If all things in the world, quick and dead, weep for him, then he shall go back to the Æsir, but he shall remain with Hel if any gainsay it, or will not weep. Then Hermod arose, but Baldur led him out of the hall, and took the ring Draupnir, and sent it to Odin for remembrance. And Nanna sent Frigg a linen smock, and yet more gifts, and to Fulla a golden finger ring. Then Hermod rode his way back, and came to Asgard, and told all those tidings which he had seen and heard. Thereupon the Æsir sent over all the world messengers to pray that Baldur be wept out of Hel. And all men did this, and quick things, and the earth, and stones, and trees, and all metals, even as thou must have seen that these things weep when they come out of frost and into the heat. Then, when the messengers went home, having well wrought their errand, they found in a certain cave where a giantess sat. She called herself Thok. They prayed her to weep Baldur out of Hel. She answered, Thok will weep waterless tears for Baldur's bale fair. Living or dead, I love not the churl's son. Let Hel hold to that she hath. This is an absolutely fantastic passage in which we get a lot of content. So about half of it presides to the funeral itself, and the other half to the journey to Hel and what lies within its gates. So regarding the funeral itself, we get example of launching a ship into the water, the building of a pyre on the ship, Baldr being laid on the pyre, Nanna dying of grief, being laid next to Baldr, so lovers being burned together. We also get the example of the gift of the ring Draupnir from Odin. We get the example of Thor hollowing the fire, so that might have been a common practice. We also get the idea that the funeral was attended by many people of many races from all around. This is obviously set in the mythological world, so I don't know how much of this reflects actual practice, but it definitely could be indicative of some things. And then regarding the road to Hel, we get the idea that it is a road perhaps could be walked, but often is ridden either on a steed or in a cart or something like that. We'll get into an example of a cart later. But in this case, Sleipnir is the steed. Sleipnir, child of Loki, I think the name translates to the slippery one, is the eight-legged horse who Odin often rides to access different realms. And so this slippery steed helps the hero Hermod to ride the road to Hel. If I were writing down directions for someone on how to get to Hel, 1L, the Norse Hel, it would be start by riding for 9 nights through valleys dark and deep until you hear a noisy river. The river Gjöll translates to yell, holler, scream, loud, noisy. So ride for 9 nights through valleys dark and deep until you hear a noisy river. Go to the noisy river and look for the bridge thatched in gold. There you will meet the bridge guardian. From there, proceed down and north. Oh, and if you're not already dead, you might have to have your horse jump over the giant Hel gate. But if you are, I think the door should be open for you. And there you go. Everybody knows how to get to Hel now. Our next passage is going to jump back a little ways to shortly before Baldur's death. And this comes from Baldrs Draumar, which translates to Baldur's Dreams. 1 stanzas 1 through 7 from the Poetic Edda. In this passage, we get a story of Odin riding to Hel to seek answers from a seeress as to why Baldur is being plagued by bad dreams. And then we get some of the seeress's information on the preparations being made for Baldur in Hel. Once were the gods together met, and the goddesses came and held council, and the far-famed ones the truth would find, why baleful dreams to Baldur had come. Then Odin rose, the enchanter old, and the saddle he laid on Sleipnir's back. Thence rode he down to Niflhel deep, and the hound he met that came from Hel. Bloody he was on his breast before, at the father of magic he howled from afar. Forward rode Odin, the earth resounded, till the house so high of Hel he reached. Then Odin rode to the eastern door. There, he knew well, was the wise woman's grave. Magic he spoke, and mighty charms, till spellbound she rose, and in death she spoke. What is the man to me unknown, that has made me travel the troublous road? I was snowed on with snow, and smitten with rain, and drenched with dew. Long was I dead. Vegtam is my name. I am Voltam's son. Speak thou of Hel, for of heaven I know. For whom are the benches bright with rings, and the platforms gay bedecked with gold? The wise woman spake, Here, for Baldur, the mead is brewed, the shining drink, and a shield lies over it. But their hope is gone from the mighty gods. Unwilling I spake, and now would be still. So in this we hear of Odin riding Sleipnir down to Hel. We also get a little glimpse of the Hound of Hel, who is typically referred to as Garm, G-A-R-M. Now, Odin doesn't actually enter into the halls of Hel. My personal idea around this is that there's a little bit of maybe animosity between Hel and Odin for what Odin did to separate Hel from her siblings and keep her locked away and trapped in Hel as a caretaker for everyone. So I think they kind of like respect each other's territory in that way. That's just my personal take. So that's why I think Odin doesn't go into Hel itself. But we also get this interesting idea of the Seeress being buried outside of the gates of Hel, and that is where Odin works his magic to resurrect the dead Seeress, to interact with her and seek knowledge. So just as the Seeress in this story has foreknowledge of the things to come, it seems that Hel herself has foreknowledge of Baldur's death, for they're making preparations ready. They're lining the benches with gold and brewing mead to get ready for Baldur's arrival. So there seems to be an indication of some foreknowledge within the realm of Hel itself, the realm of the dead. So in the last passage, we saw Baldur being seated in the high seat of honor, and here we see these elaborate preparations being made for Baldur's arrival. So as much as Hel is deemed a caretaker of the dead, I feel like she definitely goes above and beyond, at least in this case, for being a very good hostess and having a feast prepared for someone who is worthy of such. And a last quick note, this account is not really euhemerized, so it's interesting that we see the death of a god and a god moving to an afterlife, and that afterlife being Hel. As popular as Valhalla is, it seems that, at least this is my take, most are drawn to Hel. Most ride the way to Hel upon death, even fierce warriors, as we'll see in one of these next instances. Our next passage comes from Sigurdrífumál, or the sayings of Sigurdrifa, stanzas 33 through 34, found in the Poetic Edda. Now, these stanzas are given as a piece of advice by the Valkyrie Sigurdrifa to the hero Sigurd, who wakes her from her magical sleep by riding through a ring of fire into a hall and cutting her chainmail coat off of her, and waking her from a sleep that was stung upon her by a sleep thorn by Odin for killing the wrong person in battle. Anyway, you probably didn't need all that context for this, but it's just such a good story. Okay, so this comes as Sigurdrifa's 9th bit of advice to Sigurd. Then 9th, I read thee, burial render, if thou findest a fallen corpse, of sickness dead, or dead in the sea, or dead of weapons wounds. A bath shalt thou give them, who corpses be, and hands and head shalt wash, wipe them, and comb, ere they go in the coffin, and pray that they sleep in peace. So if you find a corpse of sickness, dead from the sea, dead by warriors' wounds, regardless, the instructions or the advice is to tend to them, clean them, prepare them, put them in a coffin, lay them to rest, and pray that they sleep in peace. So this seems to be an interesting piece of advice toward the idea of inhumation or burial over cremation, which is advised and talked about in all these pyres and things. There are instances of cremation. We also get the idea of respecting the dead and cleaning them and preparing them for a restful sleep. This little passage right here is perhaps the most familiar to us in the modern day West. Ideas of caring for them, cleaning them, laying them in a coffin, and praying that they have peace. Our next passage is about the Valkyrie Brynhild, who may or may not be the same character as Sigurdrifa in the earlier poem. So these are both in the Poetic Edda, following closely upon each other. So this comes from Sigurdarkviða in Skamma 65 through 71, in which Brynhild is providing instructions for her own funeral pyre upon the death of Sigurd. Let the pyre be built so broad in the field that room for us all will ample be, for us who slain with Sigurd are. With shields and carpets cover the pyre, shrouds full fair and fallen slaves, and beside the Hunnish hero burn me. Besides the Hunnish hero there slaves shall burn, full bravely decked, 2 at his head and 2 at his feet, a brace of hounds and a pair of hawks, for so shall all be seemly done. Let between us lie once more that steel so keen, as so it lay when both within one bed we were, and wedded mates by men were called. The door of the hall shall strike not the heel of the hero fair with flashing rings, if hence my following goes with him. Not mean our faring forth shall be. Bondwomen 5 shall follow him, and 8 of my thralls. Well born are they, children with me, and mine they were as gifts that Boothly his daughter gave. Much I have told thee, and more would say, if fate more space for speech had given. My voice grows weak, my wounds are swelling. Truth I have said, and so I die. So Brynhild, upon experiencing an excruciating tragedy of love, this whole story is found in the Saga of the Volsungs, but after experiencing this tragedy of heartache, she pierces herself with a sword, gathers gold around her, pierces herself with a sword, tells all the women to come and take whatever gold they want, and then proceeds to give instructions for her funeral, and then dies upon her own sword. And amongst her requests for her funeral pyre are that it be built in a field very large, so that everyone who died with Sigurd may come with them upon the pyre. There's instructions for multiple slaves to be included in the pyre. Seems like it's saying they should be killed for this purpose. Not entirely clear, but that's the indication. As well as some hawks, some hounds, and covered all in carpets and shields, and a sword laid between them, which is a reference to an earlier romantic scene between the hero Sigurd and Brynhild. So then, directly following in the Poetic Edda, we have the introduction to Helræð Brynhildar, or Brynhild's Ride to Hell. After the death of Brynhild, there were made 2 bale fires, the one for Sigurd, and that burned first, and on the other was Brynhild burned, and she was on a wagon, which was covered with a rich cloth. Thus it is told, that Brynhild went in the wagon on Hell way, and passed by a house where dwelt a certain giantess. In this passage, we see the wagon being ridden to hell that we mentioned earlier, a wagon perhaps similar to the one found on the Oseberg ship burial. If you remember too, the mention of the tapestry that was inside the burial chamber on the ship, on that tapestry was depicted a possible funeral procession in which two women were seated in a wagon being drawn by a horse. So maybe there's something with wagons and riding the road to hell. As I mentioned very briefly before, the idea of a warrior going to hell, that is what we're seeing here, because Brynhild, as a Valkyrie, as a female warrior, someone who has been through battles, is still riding the road to hell upon death. And I'm not sure if you caught it, but the pyres were definitely not built according to Brynhild's request, at least in this version. So she requested that one single big one be built for her to be laid next to Sigurd. But in this passage, we see two separate bale fires built for each of them. To provide an alternate ending to the death of Brynhild, we will jump over to Volsunga Saga, the death of Brynhild, or chapter 32. And this is the Morris and Magnusson translation. We will skip the first part of this chapter as it is reiterating what was said in Sigurdrifa in Skamma, and jump in with the alternate ending, so to speak. Now is the dead corpse of Sigurd arrayed in olden wise, and a mighty bale fire raised. And when it was somewhat kindled, there was laid upon the dead corpse of Sigurd Fafnir's bane, and his son of 3 winters, whom Brynhild had let slay, and Guthorm withal. And when the bale was all ablaze, thereunto was Brynhild borne out. And when she had spoken with her bower maids, and bid them take the gold that she would give, and then died Brynhild, and was burned there by the side of Sigurd, and thus their life days ended. Here in this alternate ending, we get the funeral as requested by Brynhild. We also get the interesting mention of Guthorm being burned on the pyre with them. This is interesting because Guthorm was the brother who ended up killing Sigurd. So we have the hero Sigurd and his killer and his lover all there together. Up until this point in the episode, we have gotten mythological accounts, euhemerized accounts, a lot of it being written by Snorri, a Christian writer in the 13th century. We do have some attestations from the Poetic Edda, which were based off of older poems, maybe even oral works before that. But for our last reading today, we actually have a first-hand account of a witness from a Viking Age funeral. So this last passage comes from Ibn Fadlān and the Rūsiyyah as translated by James Montgomery. I'm going to read the little intro that I wrote for it to kind of situate y'all in the history, and then I'll do a little disclaimer and start the reading. This passage is a first-hand account of the Norse Vikings, a Swedish group who raided and traded along the Volga River in Bulgaria. The account comes from Ahmed ibn Fadlān, an ambassador from Baghdad who had been sent to Volga, Bulgaria in 921 to aid the Bulgars in conversion to Islam and other matters. While he was there, a group of Rus settled along the Volga River and began trading. What follows is Ibn Fadlān's account of these Rus and their customs as interpreted through a translator, his personal bias, and cultural filters. we get a few descriptions of the appearance and customs of the Rūs, but primarily that of the funeral of a chieftain. So the disclaimer that I wanted to give is this is one person's witnessing of one group of Nordic people. The Rūs, who were a branch or a group of the Swedes who raided and traded along the Volga River. So this is one group of people as witnessed by one person who was from a totally different culture and interpreting what was going on through his own cultural biases and filters, and then filtered again through a translator, if not multiple translators. I'm going to provide a trigger warning here. There is a decent amount of violence and instances of rape in this account. So if you do not want to listen to that, you can go ahead and end the episode here, and I will see you next time. If you're here to stick with me through the end, let's get on with it. I was told that when their chieftains die, the least they do is cremate them. I was very keen to verify this when I learned of the death of one of their great men. They placed him in his grave and erected a canopy over it for 10 days until they had finished making and sewing his funeral garments. In the case of a poor man, they build a small boat, place him inside, and burn it. In the case of a rich man, they gather together his possessions and divide them into 3, 1/3 for his family, 1/3 to use for his funeral garments, and 1/3 with which they purchase alcohol, which they drink on the day when his slave girl kills herself and is cremated together with her master. They are addicted to alcohol, which they drink night and day. Sometimes one of them dies with a cup still in his hand. When their chieftain dies, his family asks his slave girls and slave boys, "Who among you will die with him?" And some of them reply, "I shall." Having said this, it becomes incumbent upon the person, and it is impossible ever to turn back. Should that person try to, he is not permitted to do so. It is usually slave girls who make this offer. When that man whom I mentioned earlier died, they said this to his slave girls, "Who will die with them?" And one of them said, "I shall." So they placed 2 slave girls in charge of her to take care of her and accompany her wherever she went, even to the point of occasionally washing her feet and her own hands. They set about attending to the dead man, preparing his clothes for him, and setting right all he needed. Every day the slave girl would drink alcohol and would sing merrily and cheerfully. On the day when he and the slave girl were to be burned, I arrived at the river where his ship was. To my surprise, I discovered it had been beached, and that 4 planks of birch and other types of wood had been erected for it. Around them, wood had been placed in such a way as to resemble scaffolding. Then the ship was hauled and placed on top of this wood. They advanced, going to and fro around the boat, uttering words which I did not understand, while he was still in his grave and had not been exhumed. Then they produced a couch and placed it on the ship, covering it with quilts made of Byzantine silk brocade and cushions made of Byzantine silk brocade. Then a crone arrived, whom they called the Angel of Death, and she spread on the couch the coverings we have mentioned. She is responsible for having his garments sewn up and putting him in order, and it is she who kills the slave girls. I myself saw her, a gloomy, corpulent woman, neither young nor old. When they came to his grave, they removed the soil from the wood, and then removed the wood, exhuming him, still dressed in the Azar in which he had died. I could see that he had turned black because of the coldness of the ground. They had also placed alcohol, fruit, and a Pandora beside him in the grave, all of which they now took out. Surprisingly, he had not begun to stink, and only his color had deteriorated. They clothed him with trousers, leggings, boots, a quarktak, and a silk kaftan with gold buttons, and placed a silk fringed garment with sable on his head. They carried him inside the pavilion on the ship and laid him to rest on the quilt, propping him with cushions. Then they brought alcohol, fruit, and herbs, and placed them beside him. Next they brought bread, meat, and onions, which they cast in front of him, a dog, which they cut in two, and which they threw onto the ship, and all of its weaponry, which they placed beside him. They then brought 2 mounts, made to gallop until they began to sweat, cut them into pieces, and threw the flesh onto the ship. They next fetched 2 cows, which they also cut up into pieces and threw on board, and a cock and a hen, which they slaughtered and cast onto it. Meanwhile, the slave girl, who wished to be killed, was coming and going, entering one pavilion after another. The owner of the pavilion would have intercourse with her and say to her, "Tell your master I have done this purely out of love for you." At the time of the evening prayer on Friday, they brought the slave girl to a thing that they had constructed, like a door frame. She placed her feet on the hands of the men and was raised above the door frame. She said something, and they brought her down. Then they lifted her up a second time, and she did what she had done the first time. They brought her down, and then lifted her up a third time, and she did what she had done on the first 2 occasions. They next handed her a hen. She cut off its head and threw it away. They took the hen and threw it on board the ship. I quizzed the interpreter about her actions, and he said, "The first time they lifted her, she said, 'Behold, I see my father and my mother.' The second time she said, 'Behold, I see all of my dead kindred seated.' The third time she said, 'Behold, I see my master seated in paradise. Paradise is beautiful and verdant. He is accompanied by his men and his man-slaves. He summons me, so bring me to him.' So they brought her to the ship and removed 2 bracelets that she was wearing, handing them to the woman called the Angel of Death, the one who was to kill her. She also removed 2 anklets that she was wearing, handing them to the 2 slaves who had waited upon her. They were the daughters of the crone known as the Angel of Death. Then they lifted her onto the ship, but did not bring her into the pavilion. The men came with their shields and sticks and handed her a cup of alcohol, over which she chanted and then drank. The interpreter said to me, "Thereby she bids her female companions farewell." She was handed another cup, which she took and chanted for a long time, while the crone urged her to drink it and to enter the pavilion in which her master lay. I saw that she was befuddled and wanted to enter the pavilion, but she had only put her head into the pavilion while her body remained outside. The crone grabbed hold of her head and dragged her into the pavilion, entering it at the same time. The men began to bang their shields with the sticks so that the screams could not be heard, and so terrify the other slave girls, who would not then seek to die with their masters. 6 men entered the pavilion, and all had intercourse with the slave girl. They laid her down beside her master, and 2 of them took hold of her feet, 2 her hands. The crone, called the Angel of Death, placed a rope around her neck in such a way that the ends crossed one another, and handed it to 2 of the men to pull on. She advanced with a broad-bladed dagger and began to thrust it in and out between her ribs, now here, now there, while the 2 men throttled her with the rope until she died. Then the deceased's next of kin approached and took hold of a piece of wood and set fire to it. He walked backwards, with the back of his neck to the ship, his face to the people, with the lighted piece of wood in one hand and the other hand on his anus, being completely naked. He ignited the wood that had been set under the ship after they had placed the slave girl whom they had killed beside her master. Then the people came forward with sticks and firewood. Each one carried a stick, the end of which he had set to fire, which he threw on top of the wood. The wood caught fire, and then the ship, the pavilion, the men, the slave girl, and all it contained. A dreadful wind arose, and the flames leapt higher and blazed fiercely. One of the Rūsiyyah stood beside me, and I heard him speaking to my interpreter. I quizzed him about what he had said, and he replied, "He said, 'You Arabs are a foolish lot.'" So I said, "Why is that?" And he replied, "Because you purposefully take those who are dearest to you, and whom you hold in highest esteem, and throw them under the earth, where they are to be eaten by the earth, by vermin and by worms, whereas we burn them in the fire there and then, so they enter paradise immediately." Then he laughed loud and long. I quizzed him about that, the entry into paradise, and he said, "Because of the love which my Lord feels for him, he has sent the wind to take him away within an hour." Actually, it took scarcely an hour for the ship, the firewood, the slave girl, and her master to be burnt to a fine ash. They built something like a round hillock over the ship, which they had pulled out of the water, and placed in the middle a large piece of birch, on which they wrote the name of the man and the name of the king of the Rus. Then they left. Wow. Okay. I had to catch my breath for a second. That got a little dark there. So that was one person's firsthand account of one group of Rus Vikings in the Viking Age along the Volga River in Bulgaria at that time. In that instance, among a plethora of fascinating practices, we have the idea of a ship being brought onto shore, burnt through cremation, and then a mound built over it. So this is different from the whole ship burial, unburnt, that we found in the Osberg ship burial. It's also different from the ship on fire in the water instance that we found in the death of Baldur. Earlier in the Poetic Edda, we had description of a Valkyrie advising burial for people, and then possibly the same Valkyrie requesting a very elaborate pyre for herself. So I think through all of these examples that we've read today, it's pretty easy to see that practices did vary and were specific for the person as well as the time, the location, and the culture they were in. So making big generalizations and assumptions about funeral practices in the Viking Age, generally not helpful there are some very vivid and visceral accounts out there from which to read. I think more than anything, the variety is very interesting. And I hope that everyone who's been here today has enjoyed listening and will join me on this next episode as we do a deep dive into the chamber grave of BJ 581. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Bye.